Pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Darío Fernández-Bellon. Darío leads the grizzly bear team at FRI Research, where he focuses on conducting research and develop planning tools to ensure the long-term conservation of grizzly bears in Alberta. Previously, Darío has worked on several wildlife conservation and research projects across Canada, Latin America, Europe, and Africa for academic, nonprofit, and industry organizations. His work has focused on understanding the impacts of human activities on wildlife populations, improving methods to monitor these effects, and developing and implementing conservation strategies for endangered species. Darío has also worked as a researcher on several nature documentary films and conducted research on conservation messaging. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Darío.
Thanks, Rachel. I will share my screen there. And so as Rachel mentioned, thanks everyone for joining firstly. And as Rachel mentioned, I'll be chatting with you today about the work we carry out at FRI Research. We're based in Hinton. Currently, I'll delve into this, but building on over 20 years of work that's been supported since its beginnings by both West Fraser and FRIA. And the current project we're running is a 5-year project that started in 2023, funded through FRIA and involving several different companies and organizations, and also with collaboration from the government of Alberta. Before going any further, I'd just like to mention that the work I'll be talking about today is conducted in the foothills of the mountains of the Canadian Rockies. And just to acknowledge that these are traditional ancestral homelands of many peoples, including non-treaty peoples and those of the Treaty 6, 7, and 8 regions in the Battle River, North Saskatchewan River, and Peace River territories of the Métis Nation of Alberta. With regards to what I'll be talking to you about today, I'll go through a very quick sort of like bear 101, so kind of some basics of bear ecology. Then I'll kind of outline some of the most kind of game changer outcomes of the past work that's gone on at FRI. As I mentioned, we've been working on grizzly bears for over 20 years. And then I'll dive right into the work we're doing currently. And there's two aspects to that. One is optimizing how we monitor the species. And secondly, there's the grizzly bear tools, which are these applied tools for management of their habitat. And then as a bit of a wrap up, I'll touch on work we do on grizzly bears and how that affects forestry, or how forestry can affect grizzly bears. So starting off with Bear 101, so many of you will be familiar with many of these concepts or these facts, but bears are long-lived mammals. They hibernate, they're omnivorous, they're very slow breeding, so they're the second slowest breeding land mammal in all of North America. They've got very large home range sizes, and they use different regions of their home ranges annually. So here we have a slide where it's hopefully shown to you, but it's a video of the GPS collars of 5 bears during one summer season. And you can see that they're each moving in different directions. Bears generally learn where resources are, and they tend to visit those on an annual basis. So they might know that one particular berry patch is very good, and they know that the berries appear there in sort of late July, August, and so they'll show up each year there at that time of year. In spring, they mainly feed on roots, then moving on to protein. So they'll hunt or they'll scavenge ungulates. Into the summer, they'll feed more on green forbs, and then moving on to berries and roots towards the end of the summer. And what you can see on this graph here is sort of the breakdown of that. Oops, sorry, slides are running away with themselves. The breakdown of those different foods across the year from late April through to late September. Habitat-wise, they prefer forested habitats with openings, so this kind of mosaic of habitats, including alpine and subalpine areas. And And many bear foods are positively associated with disturbances. So harvesting can increase the amount of berries on the landscape. Apologies, my slides are running away with themselves. Such as roads, pipelines, and seismic lines can increase the coverage of green plants or berries that bears prefer for feeding on. With regards to reproduction, like I mentioned, they're slow reproducing species. The females become mature at around 4 years of age. Usually it's not until they're 5 that they have their first cubs, and then they have cubs every 3 to 5 years. They can give birth to up to 4 cubs, but the norm in Alberta is that they'll have 1 or 2 cubs. And cub survival is at its lowest in the first year of life and then increases. And they breed from May to July. With birth being given in the den. So they mate in May through to July. They have a delayed implantation, and then the females give birth to their young in the dens. With regards to denning, they, like I mentioned, they hibernate each winter. The exact denning period depends on the age of the bear, whether it's a male or female, whether if it's a female, she's pregnant or not, and annual variations in temperature. But in general, you can expect the earliest bears to start denning would go into the den mid-October and emerge from the den mid-May. And dens are found in a variety of habitats, including alpines and forested areas. And lastly, bears live on a fragmented landscape. They're very adaptable to change, but humans are the largest contributor to bear mortality. So that's something to keep in mind as we go into the next part of the work we've done. So as a bit of context to look at the past work done at FRI. Like Rachel mentioned, the ultimate goal of the work we do is to understand how grizzly bears interact with the landscape and with human activities. That would usually be kind of like as far as research within the academic setting would go. What we do at FRI is we try to take that a step further and turn that understanding or that knowledge we gain into practical applied knowledge and tools that can be used by managers to ensure the long-term conservation of the species. So to very briefly try and summarize over 20 years of work, there's a bunch of reports, peer-reviewed publications, collaborations, a lot of investment that's gone into grizzly bear work over the years. At FRI, we started working around the Cheviot coal mine in 1998, and on that map in the bottom, you can see how the range of where we work has expanded from just those mines south of Hinton to encompass the entire range of the species in Alberta. And in purple there in the last map, you can see where our current project, which has been running since 2023, where our current project operates. If I was to be asked, what are the biggest outputs of those 20 plus years of work? There's 4 in particular. One is the genetic database. I'll go into this later on. A second is the grizzly bear tools, which I'll also talk about. A third is understanding the relationship between grizzly bears and road densities, and I'll also touch on this later in the talk. And then the very obvious one as well is the contribution to the inventory. So this is basically going out and trying to count every last bear on the landscape, or getting as close to that as possible to figure out how many bears are in Alberta, and get a sense of how their populations are doing. So with this last element of work, before I go into that, just to give you a bit of an overview as well as to the amount of work that's gone on in the past. This is just to give you a glimpse into the amount of data that we've gathered. This map here represents GPS collar data, so bears that have been collared with GPS tags and their tracks. And we've got over 1 million locations for bears accumulated over the years. And what you can see here, this is essentially the border of Alberta with BC. And what's mapped on here are different BMAs or bear management areas. And we've got 7 bear management areas in Alberta, which correspond to sort of management units or population units. we're currently, well, Hinton is currently sits here between BMA2 and BMA3, and Calgary is down here between, say, BMA4 and BMA5. Another example of the amount of data that we've accumulated over the years, we have a lot of hair samples from bears that I'll talk about now, but we've got thousands upon thousands of these little yellow envelopes with a few strands of hair of each individual. And this hair is actually very important to the work we do. And that's actually the basis of those population estimates that I was talking about. So the way we've estimated populations is through non-invasive sampling. And the way this works is we put an attractant surrounded by a corral of barbed wire. Bears are attracted there, they leave a little tuft of hair. We then go and collect that hair. And through genetic analysis, we can identify individuals. And from that, we can estimate population numbers. This is highly resource intensive work. So on the map here, what you have is Bear Management Area 2 that goes from Hinton through to Grand Cache around here up to Grand Prairie. Each of these X's would be a non-invasive sampling site. So this is one summer of work. So it's a lot of crews, a lot of sites that are only accessible by helicopter or by ATV. And the ultimate goal of this is to produce, like I said, a population estimate. So basically we come up with a number and we can say there's roughly between, say, 35, give or take 10 bears in a given area. If we go back and repeat this population estimate and repeat all this field work, we can get a second population estimate and thereby figure out whether populations are increasing or decreasing. The reality, though, as you can see, even just from this single map of this single bear management area, is that this is very costly work, and it's unlikely that these large-scale surveys will be repeated again anytime soon. And so that's where our current work comes into the mix of figuring out, are there ways of assessing these populations with either more efficient approaches or more resource-effective approaches. And so we've taken sort of 3 avenues to try and optimize the way we assess these populations. And the way I like to talk about them is the first one is focusing on stuff we do before we go into the field. So figuring out exactly where we're going to go, how we plan to either count or get samples from these bears. The second one focuses on the work we do in the field. So optimizing our field protocols. And the last one basically relates to work we do when we get back from the field. And that's essentially squeezing as much information as we can from the data we've gathered. I call it here beyond N because, like I was saying before, up till now, we focused on figuring out how many bears are there, which is an essential and crucial baseline to understand how bear populations are doing. But we're trying to figure out, can we get more than just numbers? Can we actually figure out how the populations are doing, whether they're increasing or decreasing, but also what's driving these increases or decreases? So I'll start off with briefly talking to you about what we do before we step into the field. So here we have a map. Hopefully my mouse shows for you, but we've got Hinton up in the sort of like top left corner, and halfway down there in the middle of the image, you see Saskatchewan crossings. So Nordic is somewhere around here, Rocky Mountain House is around there. And this is Bear Management Area 3. So this was first surveyed in 2004. And that's the overlay of the survey map. Each of those little X's or crosses is a sampling point. And there was over 700 sites that were set up that year to monitor this area. In 2014, we went back and repeated the survey, and we already did a much more targeted approach. So you can see the number of little crosses has decreased greatly, but we still had 180 sites. And so what we're currently trying to do is figure out, is there a way to focus our approach even more and still get valuable information? So that's what we'll actually be doing in 2026. We've divided this entire area into these sort of subgrids, within each grid, we'll place a single site. And the hope is that while this might not give us absolute numbers of bears, it will give us densities of bears. And it will also be comparable to previous surveys. So we'll be able to get both the density of bears in this area and also be able to say whether it's a higher density or lower density than it was in 2004 and 2014. So if you look here on the right, you can see the number of sites that we're targeting, and it's a far cry from the 700 sites. And if you can imagine all the resources that go into that versus just sampling 60 sites, 60 plus sites. The second element, which is perhaps the more fun, is how we fine tune our methods in the field. So there's a time-lapse video of us setting up one of our hair snag sites, and what you can hopefully see in your screens is the barbed wire that runs between the trees. So it's this little line that you see there. And then what you'll see us do is we'll build a vegetation pile in the middle. And what we've traditionally done is poured 2 liters of cow blood onto that vegetation pile. That acts as an attractant. Bear comes in to sniff that cow blood, crosses the barbed wire on its way into having a sniff there, leaves a bit of a tuft of hair on that barbed wire, and then we can do our work. This is how all the past survey work has done its work. We're trying to fine tune any and every aspect that we can think of. So the first obvious one is testing alternative attractants. So like I say, we've traditionally used cow blood as an attractant. The reality is that if there's somebody trying to do a finer scale survey in a smaller area, cow blood is obviously not something that's readily available. It also obviously comes with health and safety potential complications. So we're testing out commercially available alternatives as attractants. I won't go into the details of these graphs, but it basically shows you what's been most effective for grizzly bears on the left, what's been most effective for black bears on the right. And just to give you a bit of an idea of how we think about these things, for example, if we wanted to get more black bears for some reason, then fish fertilizer or aniseed oil would be obvious options. If we're trying to target grizzly bears, you can see that molasses is something that's highly effective with them. If you have a project where you want to attract both species, then that might help you choose what attractant would be best. Another aspect is how we set up our sites. So here you see a bear at one of the sites, and one of the issues with the vegetation pile approach is both that each time a bear visits the site, it tends to tear apart that vegetation pile, but also any samples that they leave there are kind of lost between all the logs and vegetation that's there, and makes it hard to sample. We can obviously still get samples from the barbed wire, but anything in that central vegetation pile is lost to us. So going by bears' natural behavior, and some of you will be aware that bears love to rub on trees, we thought, can we combine these two things into one? And so we started using what we're calling a tree corral. So it's basically, instead of setting up a vegetation pile in the center, we pour our bait straight onto a tree, we put barbed wire on that tree, and we still have that corral around the tree. So this has turned out to be super effective. It leaves huge amounts of hair that we can collect. And it also actually uses up way less attractant. So for the vegetation piles, we sometimes use about 2 liters, 2.5 liters of attractant. For the trees, we find that under a liter is enough. And these seem to be very marginal differences, but if you think of, if you're trying to get to sites that are only accessible by helicopter, where you've got weight limitations, if you're talking of you're using half of your weight of attractant, it means that you can visit so many more sites in a single day. So it's all about kind of like marginal gains, if you will, as to like, how can we make things more efficient? Another aspect that we've worked on is the timing of our sampling. So traditionally, we would have worked in this period of between May through to the end of July. So along the bottom here, we've got from April. It might not be very clear on the slides, but it goes from April on the left through to November on the right. And that red box indicates the timing where we usually would be sampling bears. What we have here is what we've figured out when we've ran sites throughout the entire season. So in gray, what you have is how many sites were active. In black, you have the number of black bear visits, and in orange, the number of grizzly bear visits. And what's immediately apparent is that there's two peaks of activity of grizzly bears, one in sort of early midsummer, and one in the fall. And so that immediately tells us there's two windows of opportunity to sample the species. And secondly, that the number of black bears is much higher in that first window. Again, this seems like, okay, that how does that affect how you work? Well, it can have a big effect because, for example, you could potentially cover an entire area by setting up sites over half of your area early in the season and then moving them in the second part of the season. Again, all of this focus with a very practical outlook of how do we optimize our field resources. Moving on to kind of that idea of what we do with the information we gather once we've gone out, we've collected our hair, what we do with that hair. Like I explained earlier, what we usually do is we get DNA from that hair, we extract the DNA, and that tells us what individual that bear is. One of the things we're looking at the hormones in that hair. And the reasoning for this is that we'd like to know from that hair, we'd like to know if that bear that left that hair, is it a young bear or is it an old bear? If it's a female, does she have cubs with her? And if it's a female that's about to go into the den, is she pregnant at that time, and will she come out of that den with cubs? So in a nutshell, we're trying to see if with that same unit of information, if you will, with that same hair, can we actually move beyond estimating population numbers to actually figure out what the breakdown of males to females is in the population, what the breakdown of young bears to adult bears is, what the breakdown of females with cubs to females without cubs. And this is based on a principle of physiology of mammals, including us. So we have this same process whereby we respond to the stimuli in our environment by producing hormones. And these are, for example, if you will, like fight or flight. So in a fight or flight response, hormones get produced. They run through your circulatory system, through your blood veins, and any hormones that are running consistently through your circulatory system actually get deposited in hair while it grows. And this is what we're tapping into. We're trying to see if that hair that we collect can reflect hormone patterns, and if those hormone patterns reflect differences between individuals. So there's key differences, and some which are very obvious. So for example, if we're talking about male bears versus female bears, well, we'd obviously expect male bears to have more testosterone than female bears. If we're talking about age class, well, we'd expect an adult and sexually mature male bear to have more testosterone than a young male bear. And so we're trying to see if we can use these hormones to tease apart these differences in individuals. And so some work that we just published looks at bears that we actually captured for other purposes, generally for GPS coloring. But during capture, we took a hair sample from those bears. So we shaved off a bit of hair. We sent that hair to the lab. And then we looked for each of those bears we had, whether that bear was obviously female or male, whether it was an adult or subadult. And in the case of the females, we could tell if they were pregnant or non-pregnant, lactating, non-lactating, and we knew obviously if they had cubs with them at that time. This is one of those complex scientific charts. I won't bore you with this, but the take home from this is that from that hair that we shaved from that bear, we can actually tell fairly accurately whether that was a male or a female. We can fairly accurately tell whether it's an adult or subadult. We found that was actually not possible for us to identify whether females were pregnant or lactating, but we were able to tell which females had cubs with them. Now, the accuracy for this approach is quite low, but the number of bears that we had in our data set that actually had cubs was very low. So we actually think we can probably improve on this. The ultimate aim of this is to, in these cases of these bears, we obviously knew whether it was a male or a female or whether it was an adult or subadult. The next step is to translate this into those tufts of hairs that the bears leave. So we don't even set sight on the bear. We don't get to see the bear. And the next test would be, can we actually accurately predict just from the hair, oh yes, this was a female and she had cubs with her. And that would be a game changer from the point of view of monitoring the populations. So with these three different approaches to optimize our field methods, the end goal of this, and no hopes, is to develop some monitoring guidelines. And so what we like to dream about is that we'll have a much more efficient sampling or study design combined with much more efficient field methods will produce way better samples that we can then actually get way more information from. So we can actually potentially get densities of bears on the landscape, and that tells us if the population is potentially increasing or decreasing, but then also understand what's driving those increases or decreases. So for example, is there a population where there's lots of males and females, but there's no females with cubs? Then we can like hone in on that aspect and figure out what's going on with that population. So changing gears slightly, I'm going to talk about Grizzly Bear tools. So Grizzly Bear tools are a suite of, is a toolkit that FRI has developed over the years. And the ultimate aim is to translate all our research findings into practical, applicable outputs. So I'll explain to you by going through a few examples of these tools. So there's the habitat states tool, and what this does is it combines different mapping of different attributes. So what we have here on the map is what we call resource selection function. This basically tells us where are the resources on the landscape that are most attractive to grizzly bears. So where can they find food? Where can they find things that they need to live? And so we're actually able to map that. And what you see here in dark brown is the areas that would be preferred by bears. And this essentially translates into the relative kind of like likelihood of finding a bear there. Because if this area in yellow is an area that is not attractive to a bear, well, we're unlikely to find it there. This area that's dark brown is very attractive to a bear. We're more likely to find a bear in that area. In the same way, we can also map risk. So because we know humans are the biggest cause of mortality for bears, we can actually map this from collar data that we've obtained over the years, mortality derived from either poaching, from collisions with trucks or trains or whatnot. And we can actually look at what risk looks like on the map for bears. And when we combine these two maps, where we have these areas of high risk in red, we can actually develop what we call habitat states. And this tells us areas which are very attractive to bears and very low risk, which are these dark green patches, and areas that are also very attractive to bears, but at the same time, they're very high risk to bears. And those are those red patches. And that's what we call a habitat sink. So that's where bears are attracted, but it's actually dangerous for them. We've developed these tools so we can map them across the entire range of the grizzly bear, across the species across the province. Just because I'm mindful of time, I might whiz through a few of the next slides. But we also are able to map road densities. I'll touch on this later, but road densities are a high source of risk and mortality to grizzly bears. So we can actually map them and help people develop management plans in relation to that. We can look at citability. So because roads are dangerous to bears, we can suggest management actions that help reduce this risk. So for example, here what we have is a road in yellow, and then in gray, you have the areas that are not visible from the road. By inserting these, leaving these retention blocks inside of the road, there's less visibility from the road, so it immediately reduces the risk to bears. These grizzly bear tools are something that's available to all our partners, West Fraser included, and we do workshops to explain how to use them, and people use them for forest management plans. Another of our tools is our genetic database. So with all that hair and all that genetic data we collect, we can actually build family trees for different bears. So we can even, for example, there's a female bear that was born in 1979, and we're already detecting not just cubs of hers in yellows or grand cubs in brown, but we started detecting great grand cubs of hers. This also gives us insight into survival of the bear. So, for example, this female bear in black that was born in 1979, she was last detected in 2008. So we know she at least lived until she was 29. We can look at productivity, and we can even look at movements. Might skip through this slide and just jump straight in just to wrap up on sort of like takeaways for how grizzly bears relate to forestry. So one of the aspects is that forest harvesting can actually increase food resources and availability of these resources for bears. So both protein in the form of ant or in the form of ungulates that use these kind of mosaic patches. But also, if you think about a harvest block and over the years subsequent to the harvest, the appearance of berries in those areas, that's a very good food resource for bears. Um, our research has also shown that food production can actually be enhanced at these harvest edges, and that bears are actually attracted to these areas. So they predominantly use those areas around harvest edges. And what you see here in blue are GPS locations from a bear, and you can see how it's using that area around the harvest edge. Areas with more food actually have higher densities of bears. So we can see how those practices can influence bear populations. And not only that, but bears that are in those areas are actually larger than bears that don't have access to that food. The counterpoint to all of this is that roads that are part of that same management and that provide access to those forestry activities do pose a risk to grizzly bears. So roads have an impact on grizzly bears, and at higher density of roads, grizzly bears are at more risk of mortality. The the key point here is that this is not just mortality related to collision, which is the obvious one and is a factor, but also to poaching. So basically, forestry roads that go into grizzly bear habitat provide access to these areas and just mean that through sheer use, increase the likelihood that bears might encounter poachers. And so with that, we're kind of trying to summarize 5 years of work into 30 minutes, and I hope it's more or less been clear. I'd just like to thank everybody who's involved in the project. You've got people who work with us on a day-to-day basis and people who work with us on a more advisory basis. We've got all the staff at FRI and our different collaborators. I have a ton of field technicians who help us each year do all our work with our trail cameras and hair sites, and without them, this would not be possible. And then obviously to all our funders, so West Fraser amongst them, and through the funding that comes to us by FRIA. And with that, I'll just finish with basically the favorite part of my job, which is grizzly bear videos, and we can hop into the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dario, for such a great presentation, and what amazing visuals. I love that one of the bear with the tongue sticking out. That's awesome. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We do have some time if you would like to go back to one of your slides that you had to skip over there, if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. So it's actually quite relevant because it's relating to. Give me a second here.
Yeah.
So it's kind of what I was touching there at the end, but essentially road density is quite critical to grizzly bear conservation. This is why I highlighted the work that we've done regarding road density as one of the big outputs from the past 20 plus years of work. And what we found is, as I was mentioning there, is roads pose a threat to grizzly bears, not just through collision risk, but also through providing access to these habitats where grizzly bears live. So you can imagine if you have the foothills of the Rockies and you just have continuous forest, or like even a mosaic of forested and harvested areas, but there's no roads, then the likelihood of people encountering grizzly bears is very low, and the likelihood of negative results for grizzly bears is obviously very low. As soon as we have roads in there, like I
Sorry,
mentioned.
Dario, do you mind
Oh,
sharing your slide? I don't see
oh,
unless.
apologies. Yeah, no,
Nope,
that's
that's
fine. Yeah.
okay.
Um,
Sorry to cut you off.
but it's no, you're good. You're good. But essentially, just hit presentation mode there again. Yeah. And so essentially what happens is that at higher densities of roads in an area, we find there's higher risk of mortality to bears. And so one of the things that Grizzly Bear Tools does is it measures that density in the landscape by area. And this is actually used for forest management plans. So what we found is that there's an actual threshold of road density past which it becomes sort of unsustainable for grizzly bear populations. And this information is used in the development of forest management plans. And so what Grizzly Bear Tools does, and what you can see in this map, is that there's road densities mapped out by each of these areas. In dark red, you have very high densities of road. In cream or yellow, you have very low densities. And what we can see is that it's most important closer to the core of the grizzly bear habitat, so closer to the mountains. It's important that these road densities remain low. Um, and the Grizzly Bear tools help make decisions with regards to this. So it helps kind of like tip you off that if you're putting in a new road to access a new harvest block, what's that doing to the density in that area? And it tips you off of like, oh, you're actually exceeding that threshold. And so then you can look at like, okay, how can I solve this? Well, you can potentially um, close off another road in that same area, thereby maintaining the road density or perhaps even reducing it. And then the slide that I can like sped through there also refers to this, and that's siteability. So if we have these new roads going into this area in yellow, in light green, what you have is the area that's visible from the road. And in this second scenario, what you can see is that we've left a little a band of trees on either side of the road, and that actually reduces that area of light green that's visible from that road. So there's actually very specific measures that we can use to continue to put in roads in, but do so in a way that's more sort of grizzly bear friendly. So by either closing off other roads when we put new ones in, or through mitigation measures that reduce the impact of those roads. And that's something like very specific that forestry management can do, and that we currently do in regards to the tools that we produce and that we work with forestry to implement. So yeah, that's kind of like one of the points that's sort of like most important and most relevant to the forestry industry.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dario.